Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week, we're taking your questions. First up are a couple of questions from Martin over on the Patreon account. And Martin asks, why does the Speaker of the Westminster House of Commons have so much power and control in running his house, whereas the speakers of our house seem to have so little? John Bercow has been a total thorn in the side of Theresa May these past few months. Would we like to see a Canadian speaker like that? So the reason why the Westminster Parliament Speaker has so much more power than the Canadian one does is because the standing orders in Westminster empower him to do so. In Canada, we have steadily decreased the powers of our Speaker in favor of giving the House leaders more authority. This is not really an ideal situation because that resulted in things like the speaking lists and the guidelines we have on speaking times, which have created far more problems than they've actually solved. So if we want a more empowered speaker, then we need to change our standing orders in order to do so. There is a proposal right now that a Liberal MP, Frank Baylis, has put forward to amend the standing orders. One of those items is to eliminate the speaking lists so that the speaker is the one who is choosing who can speak at any given time, which would remove power from the party whips and house leaders in order to manage some of that. But most of the rest of the proposals in Baylis's motion are things that I think are problematic and have a lot more potential for unintended consequences. And therefore, I think as a whole, the package is kind of a Reform Act problem in that it doesn't really do what it's going to promise and will inevitably make things worse. But that is one specific idea where we should look toward re-empowering our speaker. But accompanying that would have to also include things like doing away with the current rules around speaking times and banning scripts and things like that so that we have a better sense of actual debate, which the speaker would be able to control and police. But currently the standing orders don't really allow that. Our second question is also from Martin, who asks about the way in which we choose our party leaders. Now, we all know that I have a particular issue with the system by which party grassroots members elect party leaders. And Martin asks if that horse is not already bolted and if we should instead find some way to adapt to that. The problem with adapting is you find yourself in a Reform Act kind of situation, which we all know was garbage legislation. But one of the ideas in there was that if we're not going to change the way in which we select party leaders, that they should empower the caucus to be able to remove the leader at the very least. The problem is unless you still have your selection and your removal divorced, and you can't really effectively do that because the way in which they're selected now gives these party leaders a sense of democratic legitimacy, which is not really democratic, but they pretend that it is. And so they feel like they're empowered in order to hold this, this kind of iron fist over their caucus. It goes back to when the Liberals first instituted this in, I think it was 1919, and a few years later when Mackenzie King got in trouble, he told his caucus, you didn't select me and you can't remove me. And that's what I think the fundamental problem with trying to adapt to this system of selection is that because there's that divorce, party leaders can claim that they have some external legitimacy that, makes it pretty much impossible to hold them to account. If it was a delegated convention, then the membership who ended up voting for that leader in the end were ones that were winnowed down from, numerous delegates from other leadership candidates who all, as they dropped off the ballot, all coalesced behind single leaders. So it's really hard to have that group hold the leader to account. And if it's one member, one vote, particularly in a preferential system, again, this membership base is ephemeral and nebulous, and they can't be relied upon to perform that accountability function. So that's why I don't think there's really any way to adapt to the way in which our party leadership system works. I know the arguments against returning to caucus selection and removal are that it's somehow undemocratic, or that, MPs are this group of elites who are doing the choosing, but that's a very backwards way of looking at it. I mean, these are our representatives that we send to Ottawa. So it's not undemocratic for them to choose the parliamentary leader of the party. I think with that goes the saying that we should have a more robust role for the party president that the grassroots members would be involved in choosing. But unless you've got that sense where you've got the representatives who are empowered to select that parliamentary leader, and then who are then empowered to hold him or her to account and remove them when needed, there's no real middle ground in there. So that's why it's my contention that we need to really take a firm line and return to that system of leadership selection by caucus. Our last question today comes from Twitter, and Ken Cunningham asks, how damaging or not to Trudeau was the government pulling the plug on electoral reform? Would they be a far more popular government now if they hadn't, despite the many recent own goals, or has the BC results inoculated them from more blowback on the left side? I don't think that in the end electoral reform has really done too much damage to Trudeau. And this, I think, is partially bolstered by the fact that BC rejected it in a referendum, and so did PEI more recently. So the notion that Canada is clamoring for electoral reform, I think, is fairly overblown. It's a vocal minority who tends to be a very urban concentrated minority who has this notion that it would somehow improve the system. I don't think most Canadians really care that much about it, and particularly if any system gets more complex. The simplicity of first past the post is always one of the things that appeals to people, but then you start adding in the actual layers about things like the accountability function inherent within first past the post that does not exist in PR systems or so on, that the value really starts to come through. As to how damaging Trudeau pulling the plug on it was, I think more than anything it just was setting up this narrative about broken promises that people seem to glom onto. I don't think that if he had gone ahead with it over the protests of the Conservatives, or if he had gone ahead with some system, I'm sure everyone would have found some way to be grousing about it because it wasn't the right kind of PR system for their particular viewpoint. I mean, that was part of the thing with the Electoral Reform Committee's report, which was hot garbage, was that it was, you design a system that is low enough on the Gallagher Index that will satisfy these conditions, but a system like that is pretty much going to be impossible to design in Canada unless we open up the Constitution and do away with the way in which seats are allocated on a provincial basis. That is something that most of these proponents seem to forget. So I think it would have been a different and bigger headache for Trudeau had he gone ahead with it, and we would have been hearing things about how he was trying to game the system for Liberal advantage and so on, regardless of whether he went ahead with it or not, or if he had gone ahead with it, that the way in which he was designing that particular PR system would have been for the Liberals' benefit or so on. So I really don't see how that would have been an electoral winner for Trudeau one way or the other. And more than anything, I think he avoided bigger problems down the road by pulling the plug when he did. And that's all for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks, everyone.